In this lesson, we're going to look at leg flipping, or flipping the direction of a leg so it's pointing right instead of left or left instead of right. This can be handy if you have a character with both feet pointing outwards, but you want the character to, say, walk, so you want to flip one foot around so both feet are pointing in the same direction. But it can also just give you a wider range of posing possibilities with your character. Now, I don't have the situation here of a character with both feet pointing outward. We have a character in a 3/4 with both feet already pointing the same direction. But let's just learn the procedure anyway. And again, in this case, you'd maybe use it just to expand the posing capabilities of the character. So we're going to first look at this with our Hipster Man rig, where we have separate jointed pieces in the leg. And then we're going to take a look at the same procedure with a puppet tooled leg. Just some small differences between those two situations. So let's begin by unshying our layers. And we're going to be working with the left leg here. And let's scroll down and turn on the visibility of our left leg structures. Now, we don't necessarily need all of the structures, but we need the thigh, calf, and foot, and the toes at least. And let's zoom in here. Now, the first thing we need to do is adjust the anchor points on our leg artwork pieces. One of the really nice things about working with Duik in general is that we don't have to adjust the anchor points of our artwork pieces. We just parent them to the structures, and the structures' anchor points do the jobs for us. But if we want to rig a leg flip, we actually have to have the anchor points of the artwork match the anchor points of the corresponding structures. So we're going to use snapping for this. I recommend soloing the pieces that you need, because sometimes the snapping can get confused and jump around when there's too many elements to potentially snap to. And then we'll select that leg layer, hit the Y key to grab our pan behind tool, and then we want to zoom in a little bit here and snap that upper leg artwork anchor point to the anchor point of the thigh structure. Now we're going to do the same thing with the lower leg, the heel, and the toe, but I'm going to fast forward through these just to save a little time here. Okay, the next thing we need to do is create a small change in the parenting structure of our artwork. Now, this is only necessary if you have separate pieces for the heel and toe, or a separate piece of art for the entire foot. So we're going to take the heel, and instead of parenting it to the foot structure, we're going to parent it instead to the foot roll foot null. Now, this has to do with the somewhat complicated rigging behind the foot roll controls, but it's necessary to make the flip work as well as those foot roll controls after the foot has flipped. Now we're going to go up to the left foot controller, and we're going to hit S for the scale property. And notice that the scale property is locked, as we've looked at before. This is done automatically by Duik with the controllers, which, as I've mentioned, is a good thing. You generally want this locked so when you click and drag on the controller, you don't accidentally scale it. One of the disadvantages of this leg flipping rig is that we have to remove this lock, so you may occasionally run into the situation where you try to click and drag on the foot controller and instead scale it. It's just an unfortunate side effect of adding this leg flip option. So we're going to start by unlocking the scale property by just selecting that little bit of expression code and deleting it. Then we're also going to toggle off constrain proportions on that scale property. Now, this leg flip control we're going to create will be a checkbox control. So just like we did with the opacity checkbox controls that we worked with in the previous lesson, what we need to do is create animation on the appropriate layers to create the flipping effect that we want on this leg. And so the way we're going to set this up is at frame 0, our leg is going to be unflipped. and at frame 10, or whatever frame you choose, our leg will be flipped. And there's some specific layers that we need to keyframe in order to make this leg flip work with this leg with separated jointed pieces. So first we're going to need a keyframe on the scale value of the left foot controller, because we're going to be flipping the left foot controller in X. And then we also need a keyframe for the IK orientation. So I'm going to move this just below our foot roll controls, and we're going to go ahead and grab a keyframe on the IK orientation reverse control here, because when the leg flips, we need the knee to bend in the opposite direction. Right now the knee is bending this way. We're going to need it to bend the opposite way once it flips. I'm going to now select this controller and hit the U key just to open up those two keyframes that we've created. Then we're going to need to add scale property keyframes to the toe, lower leg, and upper leg artwork layers. We can also go ahead and turn off the constrained proportions on all three of these, because we're going to be flipping either in X or in Y on these different pieces. Now, note that we do not need a scale keyframe on the heel piece. If there was not a separate toe piece, we just wouldn't have to worry about that at all. And also, you really only need scale keyframes on the lower and upper leg if the artwork has something distinctive about it that shows the left or right side. Now, the truth is, in this case, you really won't see a difference with these simple legs. I'm going to go ahead and put the keyframes in, because in many cases you would need to include these keyframes, but you could leave them out if your leg artwork is simple enough, but you wouldn't really need these keyframes if, like this leg here, there really isn't any difference between it pointing left or pointing right. It's going to basically look just the same. But if this leg had, say, a knee patch on one side, you'd want to be flipping that knee patch to the other side, so you would want to include these keyframes. But the upper and lower leg are sort of optional depending on the type of artwork you have. The toe, if there's a separate toe piece, is not optional. The toe also requires an additional keyframe, and that's on the rotation value. So let's also grab a keyframe here on the toe rotation value. Then let's hit the U key to open both those keyframed properties. So again, we need IK orientation reverse keyframe and scale keyframe on the foot controller. We need a scale and rotation keyframe on the toe piece if there is a separate toe piece. And then if the artwork demands it, a scale keyframe on the lower leg and the upper leg. All right, now let's jump ahead 10 frames. And let's go ahead and add our flipped keyframes. So the first thing we're going to do is flip the scale on the controller. That's going to do most of the work. So we'll put a -100 in the X value, and you can see that flipped the heel and it flipped the toe, but the toe's kind of goofed up here, but we're going to fix that in a second. And then we need to change the orientation of the IK so that it now bends in the flipped direction. And then down here, we need to flip the Y value of the toe, because if you look carefully, you'll see that the toe has been flipped in Y. So we're going to flip the toe back by flipping its Y. But now you can see we have another problem, which is that the toe is not flat on the ground. It's sort of pointing down into the ground, and that's why we need a rotation keyframe here. Might be a good idea at this point to turn on the visibility of the tiptoe element, so when we reposition this, we can kind of line up the tip of the toe with that tiptoe piece there. So we just need to take the rotation value here and pull that up until that foot is back flat on the ground. I'm going to zoom in here, make sure we've got this pretty good. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then again, in this case, it's not really necessary but in many cases it would be. So we're going to go ahead and do it. So we're going to also flip in X our two leg pieces here. Again, no visual difference here for us, but if there was a visual difference, we would need to include this. What's cool about this is our foot roll controls still work normally. So we haven't lost any of the rigging that we've created. Okay, with this left foot controller selected, let's go ahead and add a checkbox control, and let's name that checkbox control leg flip. I'm going to move that up underneath the foot roll controls, and let's tab that open here in the timeline. Select that checkbox. We're going to go into our connector, choose that as the master property. Because it's a checkbox, we want to change the minimum and maximum to 0 and 1. And then we just need to select all of these animation keyframes and then connect to properties. Now, when we check the checkbox here, our leg flips. And it works, all the rigging works just as it should in both situations, flipped one way and flipped the other way, including all of our foot roll controls. Now, a couple things to be aware of. Again, we now no longer have a lock on the scale value here, so I can accidentally scale my controller if I'm not careful when I'm clicking and dragging on it. And I have lost the ability to manually change the IK reversal. It's always going to be controlled by the leg flip. But that's usually okay because it's pretty rare that you're going to reverse the IK orientation on a leg anyway. That's a pretty uncommon thing. That's something that's much more common with arms, very uncommon with legs. So let's clean up a little bit here. So this isn't necessarily a really commonly needed control, but it's a nice control to have if you want it or need it, and it's not all that difficult to set up. Now there are some slight differences when you're dealing with a puppet-tooled leg, or even a partially puppet-tooled leg. But the truth is, it's actually easier with a puppet-tooled leg. So let's take a look at a fully puppet-tooled leg with our superhero woman rig here. Now this isn't a complete rig by any means. We're just going to be looking at flipping this leg here. And this also isn't a character where you would necessarily want to flip the leg, but it's a really good example of how you would flip a leg with a full puppet tool on it from the hip all the way down through the toes. So in this case, of course, we have fewer artwork pieces. In fact, we have just one single leg layer here. So all we need to do is turn on the visibility of the thigh structure and solo that and the leg, and we just need to adjust the anchor point of this one layer. Now to create the animation for the flip, we also have fewer keyframes we have to create. So let's grab the right foot controller here, hit the S key, and again we need to unlock the scale value and uncheck the constrained proportions. And in this case, our animation can be quite a bit simpler. So we'll start with, of course, a keyframe on the scale value and a keyframe on the IK orientation control. And then all we have to do down here is simply add a scale keyframe for the leg artwork. Now in this case, for sure, the leg needs to be flipped even if we had a separated foot. The leg definitely has a front and a back. There's the calf. We'd need that to switch. But in this case, we also need the foot artwork to flip as well. It all has to flip. And because it's all connected as one layer, we're just going to be flipping the X value of the scale here. So let's turn off our constrained proportions and grab a keyframe there on the scale property. Then we're going to go 10 frames ahead. And we're going to flip the scale value of the controller. And notice that the artwork gets super goofy there when we do that. We're going to also flip the orientation of the IK. And then we just have to flip the artwork in X. And boom, that leg goes back to its normal state. And once again, our foot and toe roll all work correctly. And just like we did before, we just need to add a checkbox now to our controller here. Select that. Inside our connector, we're going to choose that checkbox, make sure our minimum maximum reset to make sure we've selected that new checkbox. Change the maximum to 1 and select just these 6 keyframes this time and connect to properties. And once again, we now have our leg flip control here working very, very nicely. So basically what this comes down to is the fewer leg and foot layers you have, the easier this is to rig. Now, if this was a puppet tooled upper and lower leg with a separate foot or a separate foot and toe piece, remember that we would have to do that extra parenting. And if we had the separate toe piece, we would have to do that additional scale flip in Y and that additional rotation animation. But the fewer layers you have, the easier this is because it's mostly about the artwork layers. The flipping of the controller basically takes care of flipping the structure, and then we just have to make sure the artwork reorients to that structure correctly. Okay, let's clean this up as well. Whoops. Oh, I forgot to turn off that structure piece. Let's get that turned off as well. So again, this is not a super commonly needed control, but it's nice to know how to set it up if you do need it. In our next lesson, we'll look at working with rotation morphs, in particular to solve the little problem that we talked about when we looked at prepping our suit man way back in the second chapter. I'll see you in the next lesson.